Hello, I'm Chris Schnee, and I'm a storyteller. Sometimes the fiction is closer to reality than I'd like. Let me start with a little story about something I learned recently. In 2016, there was a much publicized essay called The Flight 93 Election. Highly partisan, but that's not important here. The point of it was that it described the election situation in terms of Flight 93, one of 4 airplanes hijacked by terrorists on 9/11. It exhorted people to act like the passengers of that plane did, or at least as we pieced together that they did. The author used a pen name of Publius Decimus Mus. Not long ago, I got reminded of the essay and was curious about this Roman-sounding name. Publius Decimus Mus was a Roman who served as consul of Rome, roughly equivalent to president, in 340 BC. As Wikipedia describes his final battle, he saw that his wing of his army was faltering, and he went to a high priest to ask how he could save the day. The priest told him to pray and perform a ritual, and then attack. Then, quote, after performing the ritual, the fully armored Decimus Mus plunged his horse into the enemy with such supernatural vigor and violence that the awestruck Latins soon refused to engage him, eventually bringing him down with darts. Even then, the Latins avoided his body, leaving a large space around it, and the left wing of the Romans, once faltering, now swept into this weakness in the enemy lines. In other words, if you've ever seen a cartoon where a hero roars and glows with a mystic battle aura and begins kicking ass all around, this was the real-life version. The other deed the man is famous for is an earlier battle in which he was given an award called the Grass Crown or Siege Crown. This was a special Roman award given by soldiers to their commander to praise him for breaking a siege or saving a large number of lives. It was made from whatever common plants were around on the battlefield, so it was worthless in money terms. But if you were a Roman and people made you a crown out of random plants, it wasn't mockery, it was a great honor representing the salvation of many, even if it was, say, a crown made of thorns. I got through my first several decades being completely ignorant to this bit of symbolism. There's a much more famous story that I now understand a little better. The reason I bring up the Romans, and the modern writer, and the desperate airplane passengers is to talk about the killing of stories. Every society is defined by the stories it tells. There are heroes and villains, folk tales and histories, terminology and slang, values and assumptions. There's no hard line between the real and fictional parts of a culture. More of it is a kind of fiction than we're comfortable admitting. These stories have power because they guide how people think, talk, and act. There are parts of the world, for instance, where it's considered acceptable to behead family members that you suspect of adultery. Some where it's understood that you don't use toilets. Some where government officials can ask for a bribe, and that's not considered shocking. There are places where Mein Kampf is sold as a self-help motivation book, and some where suicide is considered a good way to handle shame and dishonor. And yes, obviously I'm talking about places that are foreign and other to me, except increasingly the bribery one. Maybe I misunderstand somewhat. People in those places probably have some negative opinions about my society too. Fair enough. The point is that we have these assumptions about what is normal and acceptable within our society, and they guide what laws we make against things like beheading and public indecency. You will not understand a society as an anthropologist who only catalogs what people are doing, without looking into the history and fiction behind it all. To give a little example, why in the United States do we have a 2-term limit on presidents? Why not 1 or 3? Because George Washington served 2 and stopped, and nobody dared to break the tradition until the 1930s. We didn't have a constitutional rule about it until then. Here's a sillier example. Recently, the U.S. military added a new 6th official branch called the Space Force. People snickered at it as being a science fiction concept, but they joked about it in very specific terms. They looked at the original proposed camo uniforms and said, these are for invading Endor, home of the Ewoks. They looked at the chevron-like logo and said, they copied this from Starfleet. So the public perception of a military force centered around the fictional worlds of Star Wars and Star Trek. In fact, Trek has become such an influence that it's bounced back and forth between reality and fantasy. The famous ship name USS Enterprise comes from the real Navy, where it won honor several times over. Then it became a fictional spaceship, then a real space shuttle. You can bet that if we build more spaceships, we'll use the name again. Similarly, the Space Force logo is like the one from Star Trek, but Trek's logo is itself based on an early NASA logo. That's an example of cultural power through stories. If the Space Force is going to establish itself as relevant and serious, it will need to work within the public perception created by fiction. Which means that even seemingly unimportant bits of storytelling, like Andy Weir's book and movie The Martian, can have a meaningful effect on the real world. For fun, I'll cite the case of an advertiser using American symbolism to describe smoking as part of the March of Progress. This is logic and imagery that people understood, and there's a larger story there about the connection between cigarettes, booze, and the women's rights movement. To give a bigger example, why do we have our odd electoral college election system in the US? Because it was the compromise answer to a power-sharing dispute that existed in the 1780s and is still relevant today, even though not everyone understands that. If you look at it in ignorance, not knowing why it was done that way, you might say it's cumbersome and should end. But let me steal a metaphor called Chesterton's fence. If you look at a fence and say, this fence serves no purpose and should be torn down, the answer should be, go away until you can explain why it was built, and then make your case why that reason is outdated. If you think it was pointless, you're dangerously ignorant. In summary, the way that a society functions is very much not decided by pure logic, but by emotional arguments driven by history. And history is a collection of stories that blur the line between truth and fiction. People who try to explain things and persuade people purely in terms of logic for rational robot people will end up frustrated. When humans manage to cooperate, we don't act like a machine that runs smoothly and sleekly. It's a messy jungle ecosystem. Or similar to DNA, which from a computer programmer's standpoint is a nightmare of barely working hodgepodge. And like DNA, somehow it works better than most attempts to develop something pure and artificial. So, some people face that frustration and sense that there's too much old crud and superstition in society. Burn it all down, they say. Start over on a fair and scientific basis. It's been tried in the real world. The number one example is Cambodia, which turned out unpleasantly. So what if, instead of trying to be so smart that everyone obeys you, you tried to control how they think in general through culture? What would it mean to have a magic power to control the stories of a society? You'd have enormous influence from being able to snuff out a story or warp it to your liking. Everyone would see a situation in terms of different metaphors, different priorities, different heroes and villains. Even if you could never touch a weapon, being the overlord of stories would make you mighty among men. Which brings me to a problem. Right now I am quietly terrified because there is a broad, deep attempt to slay all the stories that define Western culture. I apologize for vagueness because terms like Western culture are complex and blurry. I mean roughly the way that the societies of America, Canada, Europe, and Australia operate. Why do I care about those groups? Besides the fact that they're my home, they're also the ones that invented most of everything I enjoy and rely on, from indoor plumbing to medicine to computers to pizza to the concept of limited government. I want to see these things continue, don't you? What do I mean by a culture's defining stories and by saying that they are under attack? Consider who our heroes are. For one thing, in America we have Washington, Adams, Jefferson, and the other founders. They have statues in their honor, schools and counties and cities named for them, folklore about how awesome they were. Their symbolism is used everywhere as a kind of civic religion. We understand our world partly in terms of these great men, both in terms of the cartoonish superhero version you might learn first, and in the more nuanced version that includes their faults and the tough choices and compromises they had to make. If you learn the cartoon version, you can participate in America. You can root for freedom, be willing to defend it, be willing to speak your mind, and feel proud of your society, yet suspicious of the government. All those are key parts of what we collectively decided it means to be American. And by the way, the founders were themselves very bound up in story. They consciously referenced the Roman Republic, as well as Christianity and historic or mythic figures such as Cincinnatus and Columbia. If you were the dark overlord of story, you could damage America by attacking the founders. You would teach everyone that they were horrible people, unworthy of honor or emulation. If you pick one of them out to spare, you would pick one who was a lover of big government with unlimited power and praise him to the skies to make him seem cool. Meanwhile, you would smash the statues, desecrate them, rename the schools, paint over the murals. You would even take ownership over their historic mansions and change the exhibits to talk about how awful the founders were. The goal would be to change the master story or the operating system. The overlord's attack wouldn't be limited to the founders personally, because he would want to work more broadly on changing our perception of everything they ever stood for. What is that master story? The way that we're typically taught history in America focuses on an upward path of resistance to tyrants, establishment of greater freedom, and a struggle toward fully living up to a set of high-minded values. Nor did those ideas spring out of nowhere, because rebellious Americans thought and spoke in terms of being British subjects loyal to the British king. They bent over backwards not to blame him for a long time. To take down the royal flag and change from saying God save the king to God damn the king was a deadly moral and philosophical break that shattered an empire forever. Our founders weren't eager to take that step. Even when they did, they still argued in terms of England's Magna Carta and the rights of Englishmen, telling themselves they were the moral heirs of the same people who lived in the age of Robin Hood. In parallel to that moral story, we tell ourselves a story about being pioneers who spread ever westward, taming the wilderness and bringing technology and civilization, especially in the areas of transportation and communication. This story was so ingrained in us that it's thought to have created something of a crisis circa 1890, when the census said that there was no more frontier to conquer. It's also driven us in the years since to explore farther than humanity has ever gone, or as most Americans probably put it these days, to boldly go where no one has gone before. Because I'm bringing up Star Trek again, I should mention the opening sequence of the Enterprise TV series. That is an excellent example of tying together respect to those who've gone before with a work of fiction that even includes the real Space Shuttle Enterprise. It's a small part of what America was doing as a society, how we saw ourselves, and where we were going. The larger story of the West is rooted in Christianity and Enlightenment-era philosophy, and built on honoring the works of the Romans and Greeks and even the Babylonians and Hebrews. This is our story. For those of us who like delving into it, we look at things like who Julius Caesar was, and why he became a dictator, and why he was murdered. The old stories tie into our own and frequently echo our modern problems. To give one little example, you could say we had our own Gaius Gracchus moment recently, and Marius might be next. So again, attacking America through story would mean you don't just attack the founders. You'd strike at the basic concept of this being a fundamentally good society, rooted in good values, making mistakes but trying to do its best. You would create a whole school curriculum that says America was founded on evil principles, evil people, evil deeds, right from the start, so deep, so fundamental that we should date the true founding moment of the whole society to an act of wickedness. If you had the power to do that and make it stick, how would people grow up thinking of their country? Would they join the military to defend it? Hell no. Why fight for an evil nation? Would they want to uphold the Constitution? Hell no. It's an evil system designed to oppress. Would they support the basic moral principles, the heroes, the social contract, even the terminology? Hell no. They want to tear all that down. And when I use the word hell, I am of course referencing a very old set of stories with enormous power. It's a shorthand for the very principle of righteous yet horrifying punishment. It's the conflict between wishing doom to your enemies yet thinking, geez, do I really hate them that much? And when I say the word geez, well, it's tough to get away from stories, isn't it? As I wrote this, I was listening to patriotic songs. I keep focusing on America, but have a look at some others. To give one example, think of Scotland the Brave. Here among my mountains wild, I have serenely smiled when armies and empires against me were hurled. Firm as my native rock, I have withstood the shock of England, of Denmark, of Rome, and the world. This is a story, referencing 3 other stories. It makes me want to charge into battle in a kilt, and I'm not even Scottish. Military units had their own boasting songs, such as the British Grenadiers, which was good enough that we stole it under the name Free America. What if you could steal the songs away from a people? Tell them that public events will no longer feature the Star-Spangled Banner, and will use a new song instead. Or you'll divide people by having separate anthems for distinct subgroups instead of a single national song. New symbols, new language, new thoughts. Over in Scotland, our thief of songs will raise a generation that doesn't know who William Wallace was, or why Hadrian's Wall is there. They might complain that Scotland is ruled by a bunch of Scottish people. In France, they'll watch the movie Casablanca and not understand why people got worked up about the singing. Or more likely, they won't watch the movie at all. For a full spectrum attack, the Dark Overlord of story would also want to go after the secular, non-patriotic songs. He wouldn't be satisfied with creating new ones, to the extent evil can create anything, because the goal is to push people into thinking only in the new way. So that means taking control of famous story franchises and turning them into something that better fits the new values. Replacing characters where possible, or turning the old heroes into sniveling, washed-up failures and installing replacements. It also means reaching into every story, old and new, real and fictional, to replace the words and change the demographics of the characters. The audience will end up thinking that whatever the Overlord wants to push is the norm and extremely common, and will come away with a false understanding of history. Even the old legends won't make sense anymore, because the remakes and parodies are more prominent than the originals. The culture you live in, the things you understand about right and wrong, will be a blur. You might sense that something is wrong, but it's hard to identify or fight anymore. Hard to find the words to say what you mean. It's also important for the Overlord to change all of the terminology, so that, as Orwell predicted, it's tough to make an argument against evil without sounding foolish. For instance, he would replace the phrase illegal alien with migrant, and ban the term prostitute, in each case to make it seem like no crime is taking place. For a similar historical example, see how words like moron and retarded used to be scientific terms, but kept getting replaced when people use them as insults. A second type of language cleansing is meant to erase the idea that people in the past ever thought differently than today's dominant culture. For instance, the word slave is being phased out in favor of enslaved person, as though all past people were very sensitive about this topic. A third type of manipulation is meant to incite division and hatred. For instance, we are seeing the name of every racial group get capitalized in written language, except one, to add an ongoing, dehumanizing insult to the very grammar of the language. A fourth type of change is weird. It's about ritually humiliating you by forcing you to conform to whatever the latest arbitrary rules are. It also helps define who is in the elite class by having a special, ever-changing dialect. It has to keep changing to serve that purpose, though, because the overlord tries to control 90% of all media. If practically all media use terms like migrant, then people will start adapting their own language and thoughts due to the impression that there's a consensus. And as shown in this example here, we're being told that we can't even use old figures of speech that touch upon our own history. Even expressions like bury the hatchet that are actually respectful. Understanding the present in terms of the past is something the overlord doesn't want. Why? Because rootless, stateless people with no heroes and no confidence in their identity are easier to control. Once the overlord seizes control of today's language, it's also important to dive into past stories or historical fiction, to update them for modern audiences. Even a fantasy or science fiction story, or one set in a particular time period, has to conform to whatever the latest social dictates are, even if it would baffle real people in that setting. I'll show two fiction examples here. In one of them, the characters are allowed to have different opinions than ours. It's a window into a different culture than what we live in today. In contrast, the other makes a point of establishing a Lovecraftian noir setting with a period slang, and then asks you for your preferred pronouns like you're in a university in 2023. Recently, I saw another game that had a Wild West setting, and it opened with a narrator talking about the conflict between the settlers and the First Peoples. Nobody actually talked like that in that setting. It's a dictate that creates the false impression that the current culture has always been in charge. It doesn't even serve the purpose of fighting racism, no more than it would to censor the adventures of Huckleberry Finn, because people understanding how people thought in another era is the key to understanding the present. But then, fighting racism isn't the real purpose here, it's control. I've often seen the term gaslighting used lately to mean convincing people they're crazy by editing all evidence to the contrary, and I was wondering where that term comes from. You guessed it, it comes from another story. The overlord would also want to go after celebrations and holidays, make up new holidays, say they're just as important as the old ones, and then get aggressive and say they're even more important. Make the celebrations as long and as loud as possible. Pressure every organization to declare its loyalty. Dare anyone to complain. Once you've gotten any acceptance, or at least obedience, out of people, you can then push to make the celebration permanent. Everywhere, every day, everyone needs to celebrate you. And while the overlord is doing this, the old holidays and traditions can fade away. What people value and remember and venerate is now in the overlord's control. It's important to keep the propaganda going everywhere, non-stop. No medium is too obscure or ridiculous or petty to pump out the overlord's message. I'll show here examples of Microsoft Windows encouraging people to vow racial loyalty, and Kellogg's pushing sexual themes on children's breakfast cereal. I use that little flag-waving shredded wheat guy in a story. Here we also have the New York Post and a random text-sharing site proclaiming their loyalty to Holy Ukraine, and a Star Trek fan site doing something about disability pride, and a writing group proclaiming undying devotion to the sex pride movement with racial loyalty stripes, and Ukraine colors at the same time, and a dice rolling bot for online games becoming a permanent rainbow plus racial celebration. And here's a silly video game about robots being used to present gay marriage as totally normal, even though it's completely out of context. And a game company decided that the number one message that they want to promote for 3+ years on end is a racial movement, not their own game. I'm serious about how ludicrously over-the-top and omnipresent the cultural change is. It's one thing to say you agree with a cause, and another to push it everywhere, all the time, in the manner of the most stereotypically intense missionary. I've seen people talking about getting tattooed with gender symbols. I've seen a game that redefines the American Revolution in terms of non-binary spiritual Indians as the heroes. I've seen a Dungeons & Dragons adventure that centers around the idea of two married kings prominently sharing a bed. I've had an art gallery decide the pronoun thing is now active by default in your profile, so even if you never signed up for it, it's been quietly added to make it look like you approve of it. I then mistyped something on that site the other day, and I got to a 404 page that had a built-in game about collecting rainbow pride hearts. It's everywhere. It's absurd to the point of North Korean pageantry. People have begun to use the phrase the woke mind virus, and this kind of behavior is what it's talking about. The infected people make this message their main identity. The idea is to create a false consensus. Everyone sees constant propaganda and thinks it's universally accepted by all good people because the dissidents are afraid or they're censored. Notice that all this energy is being used to the complete exclusion of the old civic religion. We are not seeing obsessive use of American flags and constant reminders of how George Washington beat the British with his bare hands. A year ago, I went to my old town in July, expecting to see a lot of American flags on display for Independence Day, but those flags had been replaced. All of them. I've talked about statues and history and songs being torn down, defaced, and erased. Humanity craves stories and heroes, though, so something will fill the void of whatever is pushed out. We're starting to see that already. There are, for example, multiple fronts of people openly declaring worship of Satan. This is a shorthand for the concept of lies, sin, and damnation. The new followers of this devil assure us that no, they're just standing up for science and freedom in a fun and playful way. To me, that goes over just as well as saying you love that Austrian guy with the funny mustache, but you see him as a symbol of animal rights, vegetarianism, and fashionable uniforms. It's also noteworthy that people involved in changing the stories focus special attention on children. That's a sign of their intentions. They want a generation to think in a new way. They are aware of the power of controlling the tales and songs and statues and rituals. They are, after all, sometimes openly serving the one known as the father of lies. When I speak of the Dark Overlord of story, the other name might well be more appropriate. Or rather, that's one of the reasons they're so very interested in children. The other is increasingly obvious, and I'm not stating it outright. When it goes completely open, you're going to be told you're a fascist bigot if you object. It'll look like 90% of everyone is cool with it. You're not allowed to heed that instinct telling you that something is deeply wrong here. And if you have no integrity and values beyond what you've been sold recently, you will cringe and back down. May better stories guide you. I should expand a bit on this notion of devil worship. I'm not claiming that there is literally a guy with cloven hooves and a pitchfork conspiring with a social movement. I'm saying that a group of people have looked at a powerful story with a character that represents everything sad and sick and broken about us, and they said, I want to be like that. I could say that this is just young people trying to shock their elders, as per tradition, but it's gone on for too long among grown adults, and in combination with a violent, nihilistic new movement so elaborate that it's becoming an actual religion. One that specifically attacks Christianity and never other faiths, as far as I can tell. If you hate Western culture, after all, the Christians are the main religious group to either make irrelevant or convert. Introducing people to demon worship isn't fun or playful. It's either a genuine religion of evil or an in-your-face assertion of dominance over the old, outdated culture. The equivalent of spitting on you and then daring you to do anything about it. It's deeply disturbing how nihilistic this movement is. If the devil is your hero figure, is there nobody in all human history and fiction that you can look up to? If your flag is the rainbow with racially themed stripes, is there nothing you take more pride in than what you want to have sex with or what body parts you want to cut off? If the way you introduce yourself is with slogans, is there nothing about you personally that's more important? Nothing greater than yourself and the latest political struggle that you're a part of? If you scorn your own people's history, aren't you spitting on a long line of people who work very hard to make it possible for you to sit in a comfortable room and watch a video on a miraculous device called a computer? I'm Chris Schnee, and I'm a storyteller. And an heir of Aristotle and Cicero, Da Vinci and Columbus, Franklin and Jefferson, Edison and Armstrong, follower of causes that need long stories to explain them. I've contributed in a small way to that ongoing story, and I have no desire to tear it down. I'd like people to come back and take up the old flags again before it's too late. Come back and learn to appreciate those who came before. You don't have to love everything they did, but you can find stories of courage and intelligence that are worth admiring and being guided by. Finding an anchor like this for your life is not just good for society, but for your own mental health. It's not that having a society's stories change is always bad. It's a natural process as history happens and a culture learns and grows and tries to understand what happened. Watch out, though, when there's a forceful movement to monopolize the story of recent events. Lately, we've seen cases where our media can outright lie to us about what happened, and then repeat the lie over and over so that it becomes a story everyone knows. By lying in a coordinated way, the Dark Overlord can turn a man who commits multiple felonies and dies of a drug overdose into a martyr, or make the story of a rich sexual predator with powerful clients vanish from the news for some reason, or claim that a politician praised racists when really he condemned them, or scare people that a plague is terrifyingly deadly, and that widely used drugs that might be useful against it are actually never for human use at all, or convince us that a large-scale political plan totally doesn't exist and you're racist for suggesting it does, or turn an unarmed protest into a murderous armed coup, and erase an inconvenient murdered protester woman from the tale so that her killer won't be prosecuted, or suppress all discussion of a politician being a crook right before an election. What we're seeing is not a free market of ideas, but an attempt to control the narrative, to dictate what topics get discussed at all and then how people are allowed to talk about them, to set up fact-checking groups that only serve one narrative, not the truth, to suppress dissenting views on sites like YouTube where there are things I am not allowed to say. All this is an effective method for pushing cultural changes. As we've seen recently, the people who do this sort of thing get outraged at the thought that even one major discussion forum might not censor or remove dangerous misinformation from the public. Think about how far removed we're becoming from freedom of speech. We have supposedly free governments threatening a private company for not banning opinions that the state disagrees with, even after the state has been caught lying and suppressing true information and working with private organizations to do so. In Europe, they're even farther along. They're starting to outright arrest individuals for words, arresting them. All this is a long way of saying, I see the stories of my society changing with alarming speed by a coordinated campaign of propaganda and intimidation. Stories have a protective function that helps people to resist harmful influences of many kinds. Like an immune system, they're far from perfect, but they're useful. A body with its immune system stripped away will be eaten alive. What do you think will happen when every monument is toppled? Worse yet, when they're replaced with false martyrs and distorted histories that make people hate their own society and tear it apart. In medicine, we would call that an autoimmune disease. I believe that one way to resist is to remember the old stories and teach them, while creating new ones that draw on and honor the past. What else do we need to do? Well, we better consult the tales of how past generations have dealt with liars and tyrants. This has been a little essay by Chris Schnee. If you'd like to support me, I have an account on Patreon, and I have a ton of novels on Amazon such as these. My science fiction series, 1,000 Tales, is about an AI who's very interested in stories. Anyway, thanks for listening. Until next time.